was a video that came out that I thought would be worth reviewing and maybe making some points on that other commentators haven't yet pointed out, at least. This was a video, a debate on Justin Brierley's show between William Lane Craig and Philip Goff, who are probably, well, William Lane Craig will certainly be familiar with viewers of this channel. Philip Goff is a younger philosopher of religion in the UK, who has been making some appearances on some of the apologetics and philosophy channels for coming out as a type of Christian. He calls himself a mildly heretical Christian, which is interesting, I suppose, that one at least can admit such things in our day and age, which would have been much harder to do in the past. So this was interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because it was set up as a debate, which Craig, being older, I think, and also very busy now with his philosophical, theological, systematic theology, philosophical, theological, systematic theology series, volumes, probably doesn't have the time to do live debates anymore in person. I do recall meeting with him several years ago now at Talbot when I audited one of his classes, and him saying how difficult it was and taxing it was to prepare for those. So he's probably winding down, but and we probably won't see him on the stage anymore in that sense. But this was a debate. There was Craig had everything laid out. He had 5 points laid out that he wanted to address, and he clearly had read some of Goff's books or articles about what he believes. I just wanted to make a couple points that maybe other people are missing. I'm not going to address so much the final section of the debate, which was on the resurrection of Jesus and this view that the resurrection and the ascension were one and the same thing. If you want to read about that, our colleague Beth L. McGrew over at her Substack further up has a good article where she addresses mainly that issue. She addresses a couple other aspects of the debate between Goff and Craig, but she goes into more detail on her disappointment with both of their positions. Well, with Craig's arguments and with Goff's position, I think, on the resurrection of Jesus. But I wanted to make a couple other points that are more theological, I'd say. And this was basically William Lane Craig critiquing Philip Goff's view that he calls, again, in his own words, Goff does, mildly heretical. The first thing that I wanted to point out that I don't think others will necessarily catch on to, but I think matters, is that Goff, or anybody really just calling themselves a Christian, I would say this: Goff seems to be like on an intellectual journey, and that's fine and good. We all are familiar with sort of C.S. Lewis's story of being on this intellectual journey that led to a true and saving faith. But somebody calling themselves, even if somebody has orthodox beliefs, theological and historically orthodox beliefs, just identifying as a Christian doesn't necessarily mean that the person is a Christian in the sense of being saved. This is actually a question that Goff poses to Craig at the tail end of the video, where he asks Craig, "Do you think I'm a Christian?" And Craig sort of, I think, punts a little bit at the beginning when he says, "Well, I'm not really concerned about that. I'm not calling you heretical. I'm just saying that your theological, philosophical, and historical positions are incoherent or aberrant." But then Craig rightly goes on to say, I can't make any judgment about your relationship with God. And that is what we should say. In a sense, none of us knows who is or who is not saved. that is the purview of God alone. Jesus, in the parable of the wheat and the weeds, makes that clear when he says, only at the end will the angels separate the good wheat from the chaff, or from the weeds. So one thing I would suggest that people think about when somebody claims to be a Christian is to remember that, unfortunately, we cannot know for certain if that claim is true. Only God knows whether or not that person is a Christian in the salvific sense, that they are born again and saved and will be with the saints, with God and the saints in the new creation forever. We can look at the works of the person, we can look at the lifestyle and behaviors of the person, and of course we can look at their beliefs and make some kind of probabilistic assessment about whether or not we think they're a genuine Christian as we interact and engage with them over time. But ultimately, that kind of knowledge we cannot have. So one way to think about whether, when somebody asks you, do I think I'm a Christian, or so on and so forth, I mean, the really correct answer is I don't know for sure that you are, but you could take them at face value. Now, the problem with Goff here is not just that he has heterodox beliefs, and I can think we say heterodox with regards to not just the Bible, but the tradition of biblical theology, biblical and historical theology. But even if, and the one way to think about this is to think about some distinctions that scholastic theologians made, and I'm getting this from Richard Mueller's book here, Dictionary of Latin and Greek Theological Terms. And in the entry there on belief, or credere in the Latin, the scholastic theologians distinguish between three types of faith, right? Only one of which is actually salvific. And I think that's relevant here, especially since Goff posed this question to Craig at the end of the video. So the first type of belief that the scholastic, the Reformed scholastic theologians, and their predecessors, the medievals, sort of demarcated, is what they called credere Dei, which is just to believe God in the intellectual sense. It's a sort of intellectual assent, not only to the belief that God exists, but to the propositional claims in the scriptures. But the point here in credere Dei is that I can assent intellectually to all of the claims of the Bible, and to include the claim that the Bible is the infallible, inerrant word of God. But intellectual assent alone to all of the orthodox theological propositions of Christianity is still not enough to be saved, right? There has to be something more. Another term for this kind of belief is fides historica, a historical faith. So we can imagine a child who's born into a very Christian culture, maybe something like 16th century England or something, some village or countryside in England, where everybody is some kind of Christian. And the child grows up and believes, by just intellectually, that everything they've been taught is true. That kind of belief or acceptance of propositional claims as true is not enough to be a genuine Christian. There has to be something more. Okay, we'll get to that deeper sense of belief in a second. A second type of belief, so that's credere Dei, merely intellectual assent, even though you believe all of the orthodox propositions of the Christian faith are true, but it's just an intellectual assent. It's just in your head for the most part. A second kind of belief that the scholastic theologians demarcated, and which is also not salvific, is called credere deum. And this is to just believe in God, to believe that God exists. Okay. And clearly Goff believes that. I mean, even if his conception of God is aberrant, he does believe that God exists. He still does not believe in all of the propositional truths, theological truths of the Bible. He doesn't believe that, but he does believe that God exists. So at best, we could say that Goff may be saved, but the indicators are that he's not, because not only does he have aberrant beliefs, but even if he changed those beliefs and accepted all of the true theological propositions of the Bible, we still wouldn't know that he's a genuine Christian in this sense. So the third type of belief, the one that really matters, is credere in Deum, or to believe in God. And the way the scholastics cashed this out, and I'm just going to quote from Mueller's dictionary, is to believe in God, this is a quote, in the sense of a close personal love and trust in God and his mercy. This is fides salvifica, or in the terms of medieval scholasticism, fides formata, or the faith that forms, end quote. And this is really the kind of faith that makes one an actual Christian. It is a personal relationship with the true God, the God of the Bible. Okay? That can happen, and that can occur even before one has all of the right beliefs about God. One thinks of like the thief on the cross next to Jesus in Luke's gospel, who clearly gets saved even though he has minimal propositional knowledge about who Jesus is, and has only maybe asserted or affirmed a faith, a direct faith in Jesus. But clearly he has limited theological, a limited number of theological propositions, if any, that he's assented to as true. So that's just something to point out there with regards to Goff's belief. What we would want to maybe hear from Goff, and I think what we see in people like C.S. Lewis, or certainly Augustine, who did have long intellectual journeys to a saving faith, or what certainly seems to be a saving faith, since we've seen the entire scope of their lives now, is that there was a personal experience with God, something like a conversion experience. But this conversion was not just merely intellectual, it was spiritual. This is what Jesus refers to specifically and most explicitly in passages like John chapter 3, verses 1 through 36 in his encounter with Nicodemus. So there does seem to be the need for some kind of religious experience or direct experience with the living God himself for someone to be saved. Most Christians, I think all Christians, with some exceptions, will have some kind of story when they didn't just believe in God in the intellectual sense, but they had an experience with the living God where it was revealed to them who God is and who they are in relationship to him. That kind of religious experience tends to be quite powerful for most people. I know mine was. It's not always attended with things like visions or audible experiences. Mine was, but that doesn't mean everybody's is. But what I've found, at least in most genuine, what seem to be genuine conversion experiences, is that there's at least a recognition as well of something like one's personal guilt and shame before the holy God, and his or her need for forgiveness, which then is usually immediately forthcoming in the religious experience, the experience of one's own guilt, shame, pride, and sinfulness, and then the forgiving, profound forgiving love of Jesus Christ for the sinner. That's certainly what marked my conversion experience and many of those that I've spoken with over the years. So we would probably expect or hope to see Goff. We know that William Lane Craig has a testimony like that. We would want to see some kind of testimony like that with Goff at some point. And that itself probably would then move Goff into more orthodox beliefs as well. I know it did for me because I had very syncretistic beliefs before that, a sort of mishmash of my childhood Roman Catholicism with Eastern religions that I was entertaining at the time, and different kinds of Eastern practices like yoga and Qigong that I was practicing at the time before my conversion. So that is the point I wanted to make about Goff's belief, which he directly asked William Lane Craig at the end of the video. Couple other things that maybe others might not point out, even though I'm sure people have made good points about this debate. One thing with regards to Goff's panpsychism, which I do agree with William Lane Craig is problematic from a theological perspective, as far as how it would cash out as regards to an orthodox conception of God, our theology, doctrine of theology proper. Now, we did have Joshua Ryan Ferris on our podcast recently, and I would recommend those who are really interested in philosophy of mind and views like panpsychism to check out that video, because Joshua is really the expert in these kinds of questions. But the fear that I have, and that came up in the ETS panel discussion last year in 2024 in San Diego, on the book, The Origin of the Soul, which Joshua Ferris was an editor and contributor to, is that panpsychism does lead to a kind of panentheistic world view of God. And panentheism is a view that Christians have wrestled with throughout the centuries. There's always been flirtations with panentheism, and this idea of a potential collapse of God's transcendence into a sort of immanence, where God is immanent in the world, that he is, or the creation is literally part of God, ontologically speaking, even if God in some way transcends the creation that is a part of him. Obviously, this view is not, as Goff says, this is not novel. Christians have wrestled with this view over the centuries. Early medieval Christians were obviously very familiar not just with Plato, but with Plotinus. And Plotinus's view is very much a panentheistic view in the sense of the creation emanates out of God, or the one, as he calls it. And Plotinus was a very powerful and impactful philosopher in the late antiquity, and had his influence on Christian theologians as well. So it is something to be aware of. As I've done my research on paganism and neo-paganism, this would panentheistic views, of which probably the most famous in modern history, philosophical thought, is Hegel's view of God, of where God is sort of, the unfolding over time, temporally in time, along with the rest of the created order, if we can call it that. And this sort of God of process, that is in process, I think this is where Goff would probably wind up if he continues down this road, in some kind of process, theological position where God is temporal and temporally becoming the fullness of his or her own deity. And that is in part manifesting itself through us. God's unfolding or evolving is manifesting through human beings, and even in society, and how society is structured. And the danger there is that almost all progressive Christianities that we see today are some kind of Hegelian Christianity that has God as the God of becoming. And this kind of panentheistic ontology, I think, lends itself to the God of becoming, which also then, I think, puts Scripture and the revelation of God in Scripture in a problematic light, because the Scriptures then become temporally and culturally bound and relegated sort of to the stage that God was at that time. And then we get to the present moment, and the God of becoming has increased. He's evolved. So we can look back and say things like, yes, what God revealed to those Christians or those Israelites at that time was good for them at that time, but it's no longer relevant to us today. We have, to quote one recent book, we experience the expanding grace of God, which encompasses usually all kinds of things that in the past have been, and in the Bible are considered morally, at least morally suspect, if not just outright sinful. So I just wanted to say that about panentheism. Goff is right to say it's not a novel view. Theologians have wrestled with Plotinus and the Plotinian sort of emanationism, where the creation sort of emanates out of God, as opposed to God creating the universe ex nihilo. This is sort of an creatio ex deo. I'm not sure if that's ex takes the ablative or the accusative in Latin, so it's either creatio ex deo or a creatio ex deum, but it would be, instead of creatio ex nihilo, well, maybe it is creatio ex deo then. Instead of creation being out of nothing, right, where God creates the material universe and that is distinct from God, this is creatio ex deo, creation out of God. The creation emanates from the Godhead. And Goff does, I think, in one part of the video, he does acknowledge there are problems like with that. Like, if I sin or do something horrible, did sort of God also do it as well, since I am part of God in this more rich ontological sense, if I'm an emanation of God's very being. So there are problems with panentheism. There may be panentheistic views that I'm unaware of that can be cashed out in such a way as to make them more orthodox. But panentheism seems to always have been problematic for the church, even though it has been wrestled with over the years. Now, one of the things I think that panentheism, which again is a result of the Panpsychism, which grants mental properties to the constituents, the fundamental constituents of the universe, to the point where maybe even things like quarks or gluons or pluons or whatever exists, have some kind of mentality, or I think in some people, maybe Chalmers coined the phrase proto mentality, which then does, in a sense, imbue the universe with agency itself, as if the universe has its own conscious life. Now, that once you get to that point, I think you're right up against Genesis chapter 1 and the entire polemic of Genesis chapter 1 against the pagan religions that took for granted, that assumed, as Paul points out most explicitly in Romans chapter 1, 18 through 32, that assumed that the world was imbued with its own independent causal powers and forces, and these powers and forces could be worshipped as if they themselves were gods or deities. Sort of think of animism and then polytheism as a version of pantheism. Now, but one reason why I do think, and Goff does mention this, reason I do think why people like this idea of a panentheistic worldview is it offers a sort of communion with nature. Okay, we can see nature, we can touch it, we can feel it, we can smell it. If God is only spirit, that seems to put us at a kind of personal distance from God that we don't like. But I can go touch the tree, I can go kick the rock, or, well, what was that old thing that they used to sell in the 60s? The pet rocks. I can even have a pet rock, right? So this idea of panentheism is attractive to us, I think, because of the empirical world of nature, which we can touch, taste, feel, smell, etc. And also, there is this sense of awe that we can have when we experience nature. We think of like the opening of Abolition of Man, when Lewis mentions, who is it? Not Wordsworth. Emerson talks about the cataract. And the one tourist says the cataract is sublime, and the other says it's only nice. And Emerson chastised the one tourist and commends the other because the other said something true about the waterfall. It was sublime. The waterfall was objectively sublime. So there is sublimity in God's creation, just as we might see an incredible work of architecture, and we may praise the architect. But here, the idea is that the building itself is somehow the architect, right? And that, again, is a problem. And I think one reason, and I don't want to judge Goff too harshly here, but this has been brought up over the years by theologians, and certainly is in Romans 1:18 through 32, which is a go-to passage of Scripture on this point. One of the reasons I think we like to think about nature as if nature is divine, as opposed to just its creator, or the temptation here to conflate or confuse creator with creation is nature doesn't really make any moral demands on us, right? We can have all kinds of wonderful aesthetic experiences with nature, but nature doesn't really tell us one way or the other what we should do, how we should live, or how we behave. It gives us some natural law, to be sure, like only males and females who copulate can produce children. And we should look at that, those kinds of natural laws as the ways to underpin or support our institutions. But nature is otherwise fairly ambiguous with regards to whether or not we have certain moral values or duties or obligations that we need to fulfill. And I think this is why Goff and others who go down this panentheistic route are also so attracted to mysticism. And he mentions mysticism several times in the video. Mysticism can put us in touch with something like the numinous aspect of God, that the otherness, the strangeness that is not necessarily us, that is more than us, and that is sort of unknown to us. But that kind of religious experience, which often comes through nature, often leaves out any moral component, right? So we can become enamored with the power of the divine or of divinity, but with the sort of this rejection or disavowal of also the moral nature of God. And nature, the creation, can give us a sense of the power of God, that numinous sense. But again, it doesn't make any moral demands on us. And a lot of the mystics, when you read them, not all of them, there's good spiritual theology, to be sure, very orthodox spiritual theology. But a lot of the mystics seem to get wrapped up, and this is why we're always careful with mysticism, in just the numinous aspect of the divine, and tend to see like the moral nature of God almost dissolve in some of these visions. And mysticism often then turns into a kind of occult type of experience where it's about knowledge about God, and the biggest problem for human beings is not that we are sinful, morally corrupt, and in need of we need to repent and be forgiven, and that moral rupture between us and God, also a metaphysical rupture between us and God, is the main issue, is the main reason why Christ came to incarnate, to live, suffer, die on a cross, and to rise again. But rather, it's because we're ignorant. We just are sort of stuck in some kind of not necessarily intellectual ignorance, but spiritual ignorance. And what we need is spiritual knowledge. And if we have knowledge, this greater knowledge or intimate knowledge of God, then the moral component is not really as it doesn't really matter as much. And you can see how this would be kind of conducive to people if they actually were sinners and sinful and in need of forgiveness by a holy and righteous God, because it would be a way to avoid that ever thorny issue of being morally corrupt, which none of us really wants to admit at the end of the day, up and until we come into that personal and salvific relationship with Christ. So I would be careful about the panentheistic route, which leads to sort of this heightened view of nature. But again, nature can give us these aesthetic and even profound quasi-religious experiences, but without the moral component that clearly seems to matter and to have mattered to Jesus. Otherwise, I really don't understand why he went to the cross the way he did. So I would say that Goff is still off, is quite off on that point. One final thing I'll make, just want to wrap this up. So I will say this: I think Craig at around the 30-minute, 30-second mark really takes Goff's panentheism to task. So if you want to get, I think, a good critique, Craig in about 3.5 minutes there gives a pretty good takedown of panentheism and other more sophisticated reasons to reject it that I'm not smart enough to give, but Craig certainly is. And he does it in that section there, 30:30 to 33:20 roughly, is the best portion to watch if your focus is on the problem of Goff's panentheism, which I think that really is where the focus of this entire conversation lies. That's the crux of this debate, is whether or not you can, because the panentheism also lends to this sort of this God limited in power, right? Final point I do want to make, and this did come out, and I think Bethel touches on it in her article as well, which I'll link to here. And this is just a side issue that I see a lot of times with online atheists, especially. Goff seems to be a very nice guy, and obviously he's favorable to Christianity, and Christian theologians and philosophers. So, but he does sort of imply here that, in a couple sections, that Craig is not up to speed on where the current sort of scholarship is, especially when they get into the discussion on Molinism, which of course we know was one of Craig's major focuses over his long career. And Craig has had about 5 or 6, I think, major focuses in his career where he's done some pretty heavy work. Molinism is one of them. Obviously, the Kalam cosmological argument is another. The resurrection of Jesus, God and abstract objects, penal substitutionary atonement, and more recently, The Historical Adam. So one can track Craig's career fairly well, because what he does is he takes one argument, philosophical argument or doctrine, and he just zones in on it for like 5 years and just works through it. And then what he usually does is he produces a highly academic book, and then he produces a popular level book off of those doctrines or philosophical topics that he's explored over like a 5 or 6 year period. But to Craig's defense, and I'm not a Craigophyte or a Craighead as others are. I mean, I like some of the things. I'm concerned about some of his theological positions, especially his position on original sin, current position on original sin. But to his defense on this, the man is in the middle of a multi-volume systematic theology. He covers a wide range of topics, some of which I just mentioned, and he's an older senior scholar. The idea that the guy could be anybody, even somebody like William Lane Craig, who obviously is very smart and very disciplined in his research, can be up to speed on the latest developments of XYZ analytic philosophical discussion. I mean, it's just not possible, especially given the fact that he's working on a wide variety of issues, and he has to if he's going to do a systematic theology. I see a lot of atheists, especially I think more recently, Skydive Phil and some of these guys who have been going after either Craig's version of the fine-tuning argument or the Kalam cosmological argument, and they'll go, well, he's not up to date, or like he's so far behind where the research is. And I'm like, or he hasn't responded to our 5-hour-long video. I mean, okay, the man's working on quite a lot of things, not just for the atheist community to respond to them, but he's working as a theologian to give a good, solid theological survey to the church. And that just takes time. He's not going to be able to respond to every single new argument, countering the Kalam or the fine-tuning argument or calling into the question Molinism. Now, to that point, that doesn't mean there aren't people doing that. And if anybody, atheist or agnostic out there, just needs to go to an ETS or EPS conference one year and see all of the analytic philosophers of religion, evangelical, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, sometimes are there, younger or older guys, just as old as Craig, who are working on those issues, updating. I mean, think of what's his name? Thomas Flint, I think, is the other, guys like that who are working on Molinism and refining and upgrading Craig's arguments all the time. Like that's being done in spades. The only thing is a lot of these people aren't YouTube personalities, so you just don't know about them. That's the problem. But there's all kinds of upgrades to Craig's Molinism, to the Kalam cosmological argument. People can get Philosophia Christi if they want. That's one of the best, more analytic, higher level journals out there. So people need to sort of chill out or back off a little bit of Craig criticisms if they think he's not getting to the latest research. He doesn't have time, probably. And just because he's not getting to the latest research doesn't mean that others aren't. And for that part of this debate, it came up around the 48-minute mark, where Goff kind of made a claim that there's this new paper by, I think it was Rubio and Klemenhagen or something like that, and kind of said that Craig's Molinism is sort of stuck in the 90s. He didn't use those words exactly, but even if Craig's defense of Molinism is stuck in the 90s, that doesn't mean that there is no 2025 version defense of Molinism, which there certainly is. So those are just a couple points I wanted to make. The point about what is genuine or salvific belief in the Christian faith. To the crux of the debate, which I thought was about panentheism. And yes, it's not novel. It's something that Christians have wrestled with over the centuries, ever since Plotinus, maybe even before that. There are Stoic versions of Logos doctrines where you have sort of a panentheistic conception of divinity. So it's not new, but it is problematic, biblically problematic, and problematic with regards to the history of Orthodox Christian theology, and I'm using Orthodox small o there, which also then leads to sort of mysticism and this idea of mystical experiences with nature, which is in this case somehow also God himself, but where the experience with nature is more about knowledge of God, and that tends to diminish the moral component that I think we'd all like to avoid at the end of the day. And then finally, just this small point about Goff challenging Craig on, in this case, his Molinism, and Craig's argument not being up to date. Just because Craig's argument may not be up to date doesn't mean there aren't up-to-date arguments about things like Molinism. Okay, so that's a short response video. I hope it was helpful. And if you like the channel, and if you like this, please hit the subscribe button, and we'll try and do it again on another video. Thanks. God bless.